looks like it's turning, the tide is turning, ever so slowly, but it is. And that's good news for everybody. Okay, we have a final speaker tonight. Before I introduce him, I'd just like to announce that we're actually going to be marching after our last speaker up to Government House. We've had permission from the police, so don't just hang around afterwards and please join us. Okay, our final speaker is Phil Monsieur, who is a well-known musician and long-time activist. Phil's just returned from a tour of Gaza, the West Bank and Lebanon. Let's give a big hand for Phil Monsieur.
Thank you. It seems to me there comes a time, there is a point in history, and often as we stand there we don't recognise it, but it seems to me that that point in history is coming ever closer for the State of Israel. I want to talk to you today about the fact that in 2001, standing down there at Parliament House, there was an assembly like this, maybe a few more, maybe a few less, and we were protesting against the massacres that were occurring all across the West Bank in Nablus and Jenin. Now, I've been to Nablus. We've been into the old city. We walked through those streets, and in one of those streets there is a monument. It has the names, all the same last name, a whole family, on a wall, on a house. And the story is that during that invasion in 2001, during the Second Intifada, the Caterpillar bulldozer and the Israeli military that couldn't get into the city of Nablus because the resistance was so determined and so strong they couldn't break into the old city with its small pathways. They put the bulldozer outside the edge of that city and they bulldozed the entire house with 14 people in it. And that monument is there for anyone to go and see. That is the history. And here we assembled, hundreds of us, here and across the world. Then again, in 2006, at the call of the Israeli military, we come together again as thousands are massacred in Lebanon. And once again, I made a point to travel to the south of Lebanon with my family. We went to the village of Kana, and in Kana there's a monument to the hundreds of people that were sheltering in 1996 in the UN compound that was bombed by the Israeli military. And there's another house just within walking distance that in 2006 was also bombed, and a whole family, again, 60 or 70 people were killed again. And again we assembled, we marched, we shouted. And then it all goes away again. Then in 2009 again, in this very square, numerous marches and protests. And here we are again. How can we be surprised by the actions of the Israeli military? Totally predictable, inevitable. And yet, for the last decade, and I'm addressing this to us now, I'm going to have a few words about the Australian government, but as I said at the Nakba rally last week or 2 weeks ago, it is time for the people here to consider turning anger into something that is power, because we haven't been listened to for 10 years. The massacres get slowly worse. They get more brazen year by year. And it is inevitable that unless we turn it into something, until we reach that point in history where we as ordinary people, like the thousands of ordinary people, you just have to go on Facebook and you can see that there are protests in every city across the world. Thousands of people in small numbers, in larger numbers, coming together. It's time now for that anger to be turned into power. And let's talk about power. What does it mean? For 10 years we have sat by and watched successive Australian governments, either complicitly in silence or, as we saw with Julia Gillard in 2009, continually express their support for the State of Israel to take actions like they are taking now. We sit back and it keeps occurring and they get more and more brazen. It is time for us to consider turning that into power. Now, if you watch television, there are lots of crime programs on television. And the latest thing is that all those crimes seem to be solved by DNA. You will have heard, after the massacre in Gaza, that our Prime Minister has said that he has Israel in his DNA. He is, by implication, associated with the crimes of the Israeli state. And it's time for us to turn our anger into a serious challenge to this constant complicity with these sorts of massacres. It's time to turn anger into something where these people have to stop. Now, we've talked about what we're going to do here, but there are two things that we need to consider. Wendy gave you some excellent examples. Union by union in this country, those unions will sign on to the BDS. I said it to my own union just a few weeks ago at their state council. Either we're at the front of it or we're at the end of it. But at some point, we will join the anti-apartheid struggle against the state of Israel. Union by union, federation by federation. Australia is about 5 years behind other federations across the country, and it's a shame to us as we travel through Palestine, looking at the despair and the hopelessness and the powerlessness that our own country, and don't kid ourselves, the Americans give them the guns. The Australian government, in its complicity, ties a bow on it, and then the Israelis shoot the Palestinians or the peace activists on boats. We have a responsibility. We should not be surprised by the actions of the Israeli government or the actions of our own government. It is time for us to take this. Now, if you're a student of history, you'll know that there are times when ordinary people have changed the course of history. But I can tell you now that if we go home from here tonight and the last thing we do is be a bit angry and sit there watching that man from Bondi, Mark Regev, making his lies about what the Israeli government do, or the American Netanyahu, the colonist from America, his lies about their actions, or the colonists from the former Soviet Union or Russia telling about their lies, then we will have achieved nothing, and our time here is totally wasted. We have to consider two things. One is what we do tonight, and the second thing is how we turn this anger into something that doesn't go away in 3 months, doesn't go away in 6 months, and then we all come together again when more bombs are dropping on top of the Palestinians. The Palestinians, and I've met this committee, the Boycott National Committee, have given us the lead. They've told us what they want us to do. They've told us we need to boycott Israeli products. They've told us we need to get our institutions to divest from the companies that make the bulldozers, that sell the guns. They've told us that we need to get our government to stand on the side of humanity and decency and take a stand against the terror that we saw on our televisions in the last 2 days. So the two things we need to decide. You need to decide, do you go home tonight, or do you commit yourself to turning up and making a decision that we have to make sacrifices? Think of the 700 people, and there's another 3 boats that are leaving from Cyprus shortly, that are going into the arms of the Israeli military. Think of those people that have put their lives on the line. Think of the Palestinians whose daily life is to put their lives on the line, to go to school, to go to work, to go and see their families, to get food for their families. We have to decide, what is our level of commitment to this? Do we walk away from here, or do we seriously consider? Now, the two things that I'm talking about is one where we go tonight and we discuss further how we take this forward. And the other thing, the only thing that I know of so far is that Justice for Palestine have called a meeting on the 23rd of June where we are going to consider how we take Brisbane into the boycott, disinvestment and sanctions campaign. I don't really care what the target is. It can be a packet of chewing gum in some stupid shop. But the point is that we have to come together and we have to say that next time these massacres occur, we have a history of standing together as ordinary people, boycotting Israeli products, taking our unions to take a stand against the companies that profit from the occupation, and convincing our government that we have reached the moment in history where it is time for them to throw off the shackles of the Zionist terror and actually join the human beings and the ordinary people and say enough is enough.
Enough is enough! Enough is enough!